My name is Clara, and I was 31 years old when my mother handed me an envelope across a restaurant table and told me I was no longer her daughter.
She didn't yell.
She didn't cry. She just slid it toward me with two fingers, the way you'd pass a receipt, and said, "We've made our decision as a family. You chose him, so you've chosen this." The envelope had a letter inside. One page. Signed by both my parents. It said in plain language that I was being removed from their estate, their accounts, their trust, and their lives. All because I had married a man who worked with his hands. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, set it on the table between us, and said, "Okay." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. And I didn't tell them what I already knew about the man they'd just dismissed, what he had built quietly over years, without ever once mentioning it to them or asking for anything from anyone. 11 months later, my parents walked into the city's largest charity gala, and every single plaque in that ballroom had my husband's name on it. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed directly, which is its own kind of statement about how much there was of it. My father, Roland, built a commercial real estate firm from the ground up in Portland, Oregon. Not tech money, not inherited money. He started in his late 20s with one strip mall in a suburb nobody wanted, and by the time I was in high school, his name was on 3 office towers downtown, and a development project that had reshaped an entire waterfront block. He was proud of that. Openly, loudly, constantly proud of it. At every family dinner, at every holiday, at every gathering where someone brought a guest who hadn't heard the story yet, my father found a way to tell it. My mother, Diane, came from a family that had been comfortable for 2 generations. Her grandfather had owned a regional grocery chain that was bought out when she was young, leaving her parents with enough to live well and enough to have opinions about who their daughter married and what their grandchildren's last name would mean. She was gracious in the way that people with deep social training are gracious, warm at the surface, precise underneath. She could make you feel completely welcome and subtly reminded of your place at the same time. It was a skill I didn't fully understand until I was an adult. I was their only child. That's important. Not in a dramatic sense. I wasn't spoiled, I wasn't sheltered past reason, but it meant I was the single vessel for all of it. The firm, eventually. The legacy. The continuation of whatever Roland and Diane Ashworth had built and meant to leave behind. I understood that before I could have named it. It was just the atmosphere of growing up in that house, like the particular smell of certain rooms. You don't notice it until you're somewhere it's absent. I was a good student. Not the kind of good that requires effort to describe. I studied architecture at the University of Oregon, which my father approved of because it gestured toward his world, and I graduated with honors, which my mother approved of because it reflected well at dinner parties. I went to work for a mid-sized design firm in Portland at 23 and was good at my job without being remarkable at it. I liked the work. I liked the precision of it, the problem-solving, the way a building has to answer to physics even when the client doesn't want it to. But I was not building the kind of career my parents had imagined. I wasn't moving toward owning the firm or pivoting into development or leveraging my father's contacts to accelerate anything. I was showing up, doing good work, going home. And I think that was the first quiet friction, long before Eli entered the picture, the slow realization on my parents' part that I was not going to inherit their ambition the way they'd hoped. I met Eli Voss at a job site. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. It wasn't a bar, it wasn't an app, it wasn't a friend's party. I was doing a site visit for a residential addition project, and Eli was the lead carpenter on the framing crew. He was 34, which meant he had 8 years on me, and he had the kind of physical ease in a workspace that comes from having done something for a long time and done it well. He didn't perform competence. He just had it. We talked for about 20 minutes that first day, mostly about the structural decisions on the addition, a beam choice that I had questions about, and whether the original drawings accounted for load distribution on the north wall. He had opinions. Good ones. He'd read the drawings carefully and had already flagged 2 things I was only beginning to notice. I remember thinking, this is a man who takes his work seriously. I did not think about him for the next 2 days. Then I went back to the site for a follow-up and he was there again and we talked for 40 minutes. And at the end of it he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime to continue the conversation about load-bearing frames, and he said it with a completely straight face, and I laughed, which he had clearly anticipated because he was already smiling. We got coffee. It was not about load-bearing frames. He was funny in a dry, unhurried way. He was curious, genuinely curious, not performatively so. He asked questions and then listened to the answers with the kind of attention that makes you realize how rarely people actually do that. He had grown up in a small town in eastern Oregon, the second of 3 brothers, in a family that worked construction for generations. He'd spent his 20s building things, learning things, traveling between job sites in different parts of the West Coast. He had no college degree. He had no investment portfolio, he talked about. He drove a truck that was 12 years old and kept immaculately maintained. My parents met him about 3 months in. I brought him to a Sunday dinner that my mother had organized for no particular occasion. She liked to host, and a Sunday dinner was her format of choice, the kind where good china appeared without comment and the wines were chosen deliberately. Eli came with a bottle of Oregon Pinot, dressed neatly but not fussily, shook my father's hand, and spent the first hour of dinner being perfectly pleasant. My father asked about his work. Eli explained that he ran his own small carpentry operation, residential and commercial finish work, custom furniture on the side. My father asked what his revenue looked like, which was the kind of question my father asked directly, without registering that it might be unusual. Eli named a number that was honest, but modest. My father nodded in the way that means the conversation is already resolved for him. My mother asked about his family, his background, his plans. She was gracious about it. She always was. But I knew the frequency she was operating on, and I watched her eyes settle into something fixed and quiet while she smiled. After dinner, while Eli was helping clear plates, which he did without being asked, which I noticed, my father found a moment to speak to me in the hallway outside the kitchen. He seems like a decent enough person, my father said. But Clara, think about what you're doing. I said I wasn't doing anything except having dinner. You know what I mean, he said, and left it there. My mother's follow-up came by phone 2 days later. She was, as always, careful and measured. She didn't use words like beneath us, at least not directly. She used words like compatibility and trajectory and the kind of life you've been raised to expect. She said she just wanted me to make sure I was thinking clearly. She said she hoped I wasn't making a decision based on something temporary. I told her I appreciated her concern and that I was thinking very clearly. Neither of those conversations changed anything. Eli and I got engaged 14 months after our first coffee. He proposed in his workshop, late on a Saturday afternoon, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, with a ring he had made himself, a thin band of walnut and a small inset stone that had belonged to his grandmother. It was the most considered, specific, personal object anyone had ever handed me. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I told my parents over the phone that same night. My father was quiet for a long moment and then said, I see. My mother said she was happy for me and that we'd talk soon. Her voice had the particular quality of someone managing their expression very carefully even when no one can see them. We talked soon. It was not a good conversation. Over the following 6 weeks, there were several of those conversations, in various configurations, just my mother, both parents together, one dinner at their house where my father presented what he called a practical concern about long-term financial alignment, which was his way of discussing, in the language of spreadsheets, why he thought I was making an error. Eli was not invited to that dinner. I found that notable. I didn't fight with them. That's the thing I want you to understand. I wasn't defiant or dramatic about any of it. I listened. I nodded. I said, each time, that I had heard them, and that I was going to marry Eli, and that I hoped they would come to the wedding. My father's jaw tightened every time I said it. My mother's eyes did something complicated. The wedding was small. 22 people in a renovated barn outside Portland, on a Saturday in early October. String lights, farm tables, Eli's brother as his best man. My maid of honor was my closest friend from university, Sasha, who had met Eli 3 times and told me after the second time that she had never seen me as comfortable around another person as I was with him. My parents did not attend. They sent no card, no message, no flowers. We got a single voicemail from my mother's phone. Not her voice, just silence, then a disconnect, like she had dialed, and then stood there, and then hung up. I replayed it once, and then deleted it. The anchor elder in my life was not a grandparent, as it turned out. It was Eli's mother. Vera Voss was 63 years old, originally from the Willamette Valley, and had spent her life as a bookkeeper for her husband's construction company first, then for a small county nonprofit after he passed, which was when Eli was 19 and had stepped into a larger role in the family than he'd planned. She was small and unhurried, and had the kind of intelligence that runs quiet and steady and doesn't need to demonstrate itself. She had no idea what Eli had built in the financial sense. That was the remarkable thing I would understand only later. He had kept it entirely separate from his family relationships, not out of secrecy, but out of a genuine conviction that money shouldn't change how people see you. Vera welcomed me into her family with a specific warmth of someone who has decided you belong there and doesn't need to announce it. She just folded me in. She called on Sundays. She remembered things I had mentioned weeks before. When I told her, quietly, that my own parents had not come to the wedding, she held my hand and said, "Their loss is our gain," and I had to look away because something tightened in my throat that I wasn't ready to deal with in front of her. She was the one who told me, about 2 months after the wedding, that she didn't know what Eli had done with all those years of work and saving, but that she knew he was the kind of man who built things for the long run. He was never flashy about anything, she said. Not since he was a boy. He just did the work and put things away. I asked her what she meant by put things away. She smiled in a way that suggested she'd already said more than she meant to.
Ask him, she said.
I did ask him. That night, at our kitchen table, over takeout noodles, I asked Eli what his mother meant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and came back with his laptop and opened a folder I had never seen. I should go back, because the story of what my parents did didn't happen in one moment. It assembled itself slowly, the way structural damage does. Invisible for a long time, then suddenly load-bearing. The restaurant dinner happened 8 months after the wedding. My mother called and asked if we'd meet them. I told Eli, who said it was my call. I said yes because I still believed, I think I always believed, longer than was reasonable, that the door was open. That if they saw us together, settled, good, they would recalibrate. People do that sometimes. They hold a position, and then time and evidence move them. We met at a restaurant in the Pearl District that my parents had favored for years, a formal French place with white tablecloths and a maitre d' who knew my father's name. I remember thinking when we walked in that the choice of venue was itself a kind of signal, though I couldn't have said exactly what it signaled yet. The first 40 minutes were fine.
Cautious, but fine.
My father asked about my work. My mother asked about the apartment Eli and I had moved into. She asked whether we were thinking about a house. Eli said we were in the early stages of looking. My father asked about the carpentry work, about whether Eli had considered moving into project management or contracting at a larger scale. Eli said he was happy with what he had. My father nodded with the particular patience of a man who considers himself in a waiting period. Then my mother, between the appetizer plates being cleared and the main course arriving, reached into her bag and set an envelope on the table. "We've been talking," she said. "As a family. Your father and I." I looked at the envelope. It was sealed. "We want you to understand," she continued, "that this isn't a punishment and it isn't about anger. It's a decision. About what we've built and what we intend to do with it. We feel, and we've thought about this for a long time, that the direction of your life has moved away from what we envisioned. And we think it's cleaner, for everyone, to make that formal now rather than let it become a complication later." Eli's hand found mine under the table. My father spoke then, the first time either of them had addressed me directly. "Your name will be removed from the trust and from the estate documents. The firm will pass to the board and ultimately to a charitable vehicle we're establishing. You won't be responsible for any of it going forward, and you won't receive any portion of it." He paused. "We've talked to the attorneys. It's done." I picked up the envelope. I opened it. One page, as I mentioned. dense legal language at the top, then a personal paragraph at the bottom in my mother's handwriting, 3 sentences that said, in effect, that they loved me, that this was not easy, and that they hoped I would understand in time that some decisions are made out of love even when they don't look like it. I read it twice. Then I set it back on the table. Eli said nothing. His hand stayed in mine. My father refilled his wine glass. I said, "Okay." My mother's face did something, a small compression around the eyes that might have been relief or might have been something else. "We hoped you might have more to say," she said.
I don't, I said.
We stayed for the main course, because leaving felt like the kind of gesture I didn't want to make. We ate. There was intermittent conversation about things unrelated to the envelope sitting on the table between us. Then we said goodbye outside the restaurant. My mother hugged me, briefly, the way you'd hug an acquaintance. My father shook Eli's hand. I noticed that, the handshake, that he still extended it, and then we got into Eli's truck and drove home. On the way home, I kept my face turned toward the window. Not crying. Just very still. "Are you okay?" Eli asked. "Not yet," I said. "I'll tell you when I am." "Okay," he said, which was the right answer. What followed was not dramatic. There was no scene, no confrontation, no follow-up letter from me. The separation happened the way quiet separations do, through absence. My parents stopped calling. I stopped calling. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. I knew from occasional mutual connections that my parents were fine, active, attending things, presenting themselves as they always had. I was told once, secondhand through a former colleague of my mother's who ran into me at an industry event, that my parents mentioned me occasionally as having gone her own way, which is the kind of phrasing designed to make a choice sound like a departure from sense. I don't know whether they were ashamed or relieved or still quietly certain I would come back around. I never asked anyone to find out. What I was focused on in those months was something else. Because in that conversation at our kitchen table, over takeout noodles, Eli had opened a folder on his laptop and shown me something. And what I had learned, in the weeks following, as I began to understand the full shape of it, was that the man my parents had dismissed as a carpenter, the man they'd handed an envelope over, had spent 14 years quietly, methodically, doing something extraordinary. I didn't know everything at once. It came in layers. And I need to tell you what it was, but not yet. Because the shape of the story requires that you understand the gala first. In the spring, about 11 months after the restaurant, I was at a professional event, a design and development mixer at a gallery in the Pearl District, when a colleague of mine, a project manager named David who I'd known since my early 20s, found me near the catering table and said, "Did you see who's the lead sponsor for the Cascade Foundation Gala this year?" I said I hadn't been following it. "Someone called the Voss Foundation," he said.
New.
Nobody in the room knows who it is. The organizing committee has been tight-lipped, but they apparently committed to a level of underwriting that made the chair nearly fall out of her chair. I kept my expression very level. "Interesting," I said. "You don't know anything about that?" he said, watching my face. "I should get another drink," I said. The Cascade Foundation Gala was the city's most significant annual charity event, a formal dinner for 400 guests at the Portland Art Museum's main atrium, attended by virtually every significant business, civic, and philanthropic figure in the city. My parent had attended for at least 15 consecutive years. It was one of the events around which they organized their social calendar. My father served on the Cascade Foundation board. 3 weeks later, a formal invitation arrived at our apartment, addressed to both Eli and myself. Eli set it on the counter, without comment. I picked it up and looked at the return address, and then looked at him. "Should we go?" I said. He poured himself a glass of water. "What do you think?" "I think we should get dressed up," I said. He smiled. The gala was on a Friday in late spring. The Portland Art Museum atrium had been transformed, as it always was for this event, into something that justified the ticket price. Tall floral arrangements, round tables dressed in deep navy linen, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look like they've made good decisions. The crowd arriving at the entrance was exactly what you'd expect. Developers and attorneys and hospital administrators and the kind of philanthropists who sit on multiple boards and know each other by first name. I wore a midnight blue dress I had owned for 2 years and not had occasion to wear. Eli wore a charcoal suit. He looked completely at ease, which was simply how he moved through the world, unhurried, settled in himself, not performing anything. We collected our name cards at the registration table. The volunteer at the table looked at Eli's card, then at him, and then said, with slightly more attention than the previous guests had received, "Mr. Voss, welcome. The organizing chair asked me to make sure you'd received your place assignment. You're at table 1. Eli thanked her pleasantly, and we moved inside. The room was at perhaps 60% capacity when we arrived, the pre-dinner cocktail hour still running, clusters of guests at the perimeter, a string quartet doing low background work near the far wall. Catering staff moved with the practiced invisibility of people who do this well. The atrium's high glass ceiling was dark against the evening sky, and below it the entire space was arranged around a raised platform at one end where a simple lectern and screen were positioned. Around the room, on the walls and on display panels interspersed through the space, the gala's sponsor acknowledgments had been arranged. Beautifully produced. Printed on good board stock, framed, positioned at intervals so that arriving guests could take them in as they circulated. And on every single one of them, at the top, in the position reserved for the gala's lead benefactor, was the name, the Voss Foundation. Not the Voss Foundation, a division of something else. Not a smaller acknowledgement nested within a larger donor listing. The Voss Foundation, alone at the top in the visual hierarchy that these things communicate unmistakably to people who have attended enough events to read them. I watched a woman near the entrance read one of the panels and turn to the man beside her and say something. I watched him look at the panel, and then at her. I didn't know them. Eli was speaking to a server about the wine selection. He seemed entirely uninterested in the panels. I found Sasha near the bar. She was attending as the guest of a mutual friend who worked in the philanthropic sector, and she grabbed my arm the moment she saw me. "Clara," she said, and her voice was low and very controlled, the voice she uses when she is trying not to be visibly losing her mind. "What is happening?" "Get a drink," I told her. "You're going to want one." I did not look for my parents yet. I knew they were in the room. I had caught a peripheral sense of my father's particular posture near the far entrance, the way he stands at an event like this with one hand in his jacket pocket and a slight survey in his gaze. I had not made eye contact. I didn't need to. Not yet. The cocktail hour wound toward its end, and the event staff began indicating that guests should find their tables. Eli appeared beside me, handed me a glass of sparkling water, and offered his arm. We moved toward table 1. Table 1 was positioned closest to the podium, the table where the gala's organizing leadership sat alongside its principal guests, which in this event structure meant alongside its lead benefactor. The table was already occupied by 4 other guests, the foundation's executive director, a woman named Patricia, who I had met once at a different event, her deputy, and 2 members of the gala committee. They stood as we approached, which is the kind of small social gesture that carries real information in these settings. "Mr. and Mrs. Voss," Patricia said, and her voice had the warmth of someone who has been very much looking forward to this meeting. "We are so grateful. So genuinely grateful." I watched Eli shake her hand and say, simply, "We're glad to be here." We sat. The room settled. The lights shifted slightly, directing attention toward the platform. And somewhere to my left, in the general arrangement of tables spreading back through the atrium, I heard a sharp intake of breath that I recognized. I did not look over. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my expression pleasant, and I stayed very still. Patricia moved to the lectern at 10 minutes past 7. She was 60, trim, with the kind of direct eye contact that comes from decades of asking people for money on behalf of things she believed in. She welcomed the room with the particular authority of someone who is genuinely running the evening, thanked the guests, acknowledged the work of the gala committee, and then paused. "This year," she said, "we have the honor of announcing a partnership that I believe will define the next decade of the Cascade Foundation's work." The room was fully quiet. 400 people at linen dress tables, wine glasses held still. The Voss Foundation, Patricia said, was established 6 years ago by a Portland area entrepreneur with a remarkably specific mission: to fund early education and vocational training programs in underserved communities across Oregon and Washington. Over 6 years, the Voss Foundation has quietly dispersed funding that has supported 14 programs in 11 counties.
She paused.
I say quietly because until this year, the Voss Foundation has not held a public profile. Its contributions have been made without public acknowledgement, without naming rights, and without any expectation of credit. A murmur moved through the room. Patricia's voice remained even. This year, at our request, and after a great deal of persuasion, the Foundation's founder agreed to allow public acknowledgement of the Voss Foundation's lead gift to the Cascade Foundation's endowment. A gift of $850,000. The room produced the sound that rooms produce when a real number lands in them, a collective intake. A shift of posture. $850,000 inside the survival rules of this world, as a gift from a standing foundation, is a number that communicates something specific and legible to everyone in the room. We are told, Patricia continued, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this and wants to get it exactly right, that the Voss Foundation was built over 14 years through the accumulated returns of a small number of privately held real estate investments, managed without staff, without fanfare, and without any external capital. The founder is here tonight. She smiled toward Table 1. We are glad that he finally let us say his name out loud. She gestured toward Eli. 400 people looked at Table 1. My husband stood. He buttoned his jacket, nodded once. Not a bow, not a performer's gesture, just an acknowledgement, and sat back down. I kept my eyes on the table. Not because I was trying to appear unmoved, because I genuinely, in that moment, needed a second to find the surface of myself. Something in my chest had gone very warm and then very still, and I had learned enough about myself by then to know that the only thing to do with that feeling in public was to breathe through it. After perhaps 4 seconds, I looked up. The atrium was still oriented toward Table 1, the way rooms orient when they have just learned something that realigns the social geometry. Patricia was concluding her introduction, moving toward the next portion of the program, but the reorientation had happened, and it was not going to unhappen. And at a table I could now place, roughly 15 feet to my left and 2 tables back, I could see my parents. My father was very still. His hand, which had been around a wine glass when the room last settled into position, was no longer holding it. It was flat on the table, fingers slightly spread, the way a hand lands when the body needs something solid. The color had drained from around his mouth in a way that made the rest of his face look wrong, overlit, like a photograph with the exposure adjusted incorrectly. My mother was looking at me. Not at the lectern, not at Patricia, not at the room. At me. Her face had done the thing I had very rarely seen it do. It had lost its management. The precision, the careful social surface, the warmth with information, all of it had simply dropped. What was underneath was not anger. It was something much more complicated that I did not have a clean word for and did not particularly want one. I held her gaze for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3. I nodded. Once small, the same way Eli had nodded at the room. Then I turned back to the table. Sasha, from her position across the room, texted me at 7:22. The message said, "And then, I am not okay." I texted back, "I know." The program continued. There was a video presentation about the Cascade Foundation's education initiatives. There was a second speaker who discussed the vocational training outcomes in specific counties. When she named one of the programs, a woodworking and construction trades program for 17 and 18-year-olds in Deschutes County, funded for 4 consecutive years, I heard Eli exhale beside me, the quiet exhale of a person who is satisfied that something he worked on is being talked about correctly. I reached under the table and put my hand in his. Over the course of the dinner, a procession of people came to Table 1. Quietly, in the way that attendees at this kind of event manage their approaches. Not in a cluster, not in a way that would seem like a scene, but 1 and 2 at a time. Developers and attorneys and foundation directors, and people whose titles I had to piece together from context. They introduced themselves to Eli. They thanked him. Several of them said variations of "I had no idea," with a specific inflection of someone who is recalibrating. Eli thanked each of them. He asked, in almost every case, about their work rather than discussing his own. He was completely, absolutely himself. The same man who had read the drawings on a job site and had opinions about load distribution. The same man who had made a ring out of walnut and a grandmother's stone. The same man who drove a 12-year-old truck and kept it immaculately maintained. Toward the end of dinner, a man named Gerald Fitch, who I knew was a longtime associate of my father's, a real estate attorney who had worked with Roland Ashworth's firm for at least a decade, came to the table and introduced himself to Eli. I watched them shake hands. I watched Gerald look at me with an expression I could not fully read, something between recognition and recalibration, and then I watched him say something to Eli that I couldn't hear over the ambient noise of the room. Eli's response, which I caught because he'd turned slightly toward me. "Nice to meet you, Gerald. I've heard good things about the firm." Gerald went back to his table. I did not look toward my parents. I had 4 words later in a different context, and I'll get to them. But in that moment, I had nothing to say. The room had already said it. The gala ended at 10. Patricia found us near the coat check and held both of Eli's hands in hers and said, "I cannot tell you what this evening means. For the programs, for the communities, but also just for us to be able to put a face to this." She glanced at me. "And to finally meet you, Mrs. Voss. Your husband is extraordinary." I said, "I know." Which is the truest thing I've ever said at a coat check. We drove home. Eli put Chet Baker on the stereo, which is what he does when he's content. I sat in the passenger seat with my heels off and my feet on the dash and watched the city go by. "How do you feel?" I said. "Good," he said. "Hungry. We should get something." We got late-night pho from a place that was open until 2 and ate it at our kitchen table. I had a small pang of something that was not sadness but was adjacent to it, the sensation of a night that was enormous in its way, and then the immediate return to normalcy. Eli eating noodles in his suit jacket, the overhead kitchen light, the particular quiet of a Friday just past 10. Ordinary. On purpose. By choice. What followed over the next weeks was not something I orchestrated or tracked closely. Word travels in a city like Portland, especially in the interlocking circles of business and philanthropy and civic life that my parents had spent 30 years inhabiting. The gala had 400 attendees who each had their own networks. Patricia had sent a post-event communication to all attendees that named the Voss Foundation and described the gift. A local business journal ran a short item, not a feature, just an item, noting the Cascade Foundation's new principal donor and making mention of the Voss Foundation's 14-year record of quiet contributions. I didn't send it to my parents. I didn't forward it to anyone in their circle with a note. I didn't need to. Gerald Fitch called my father, I was told later. The chair of a development council my father sat on apparently brought it up at their next meeting, not cruelly, simply as a matter of social news, the way people mention things they assume are known. A woman on the Cascade Foundation board, who had worked professionally with my mother, apparently emailed her. My mother called me on a Wednesday morning, 18 days after the gala. I was at my desk at the firm when her name appeared on my phone. I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I answered. "Clara," she said. Her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, something stripped of its usual architectural control, something that was reaching. "Mom," I said. A pause. I didn't know. Her voice was even, but the evenness had cost her something. "About Eli. About any of it. I want you to know that I understand now that she stopped. I was wrong. We were wrong." I said, "I know you were." Another pause. I let it sit. "I'd like to see you," she said. "If you'd be willing." I said, "I'll think about it and let you know." She said okay. My father did not call for another 12 days after that. When he did, it was on a Saturday evening, and his call was shorter. He said my name. He said he hoped I was well. He said he was proud of Eli's work, what he's done for those programs, specifically, which I thought was the most honest thing my father had said in a long time because it named the actual thing rather than the status of it. He said he'd been speaking to my mother, and that they both hoped, when I was ready, that we could all have dinner. I said, "We'll see." He said okay. I didn't tell Eli about either call that day. I made coffee, took it to the back porch, and sat with it until the light changed. There was a lot to turn over. What reconciliation might look like, what I needed from it if it happened, what Eli and I had built in the space that their absence had left, and whether I wanted to rearrange that space for people who might fill it differently now. There are no fast answers to those questions. I didn't try to arrive at any. Sasha, when I told her about the calls, said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to take my time." She nodded.
Good.
Gerald Fitch did one other thing, which I'll mention because it's part of the full picture. He reached out to Eli directly, not through me, not through my father, and asked if Eli would be interested in consulting on a development project his firm was advising on, specifically because the project included a community vocational component, and they were looking for someone with genuine expertise in that space, not just the optics of it. Eli took the meeting. He came home from it thoughtful. "Interesting project," he said. "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him I'd need to see the full proposal." "That sounds right," I said. He shrugged. "It's good work if it's real." That's the thing about Eli. It was never about the room knowing. It was always about whether the work was real. Here is what I've understood in the time since that evening. The people who dismiss you based on what they can see of someone at a dinner table are not wrong because they're cruel. They're wrong because they've confused the surface for the substance, the visible for the true. My parents built real things. My father built a real firm. My mother built a real social world. And somewhere in that building they started to believe that the visible and the valuable were the same thing. That what could be named at a dinner party was what mattered. That what couldn't be easily presented was what didn't count. Eli had 14 years of work that couldn't be easily presented. 14 years of decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with how they'd look over white tablecloths. He gave that work away, essentially, not for credit, not for a network, but because he thought it was the right use of what he had accumulated. And the room found out anyway. Rooms always do. The envelope my mother slid across that table was meant to close something. What it actually did was give us the space to build the life we were going to build anyway, without interruption, without the constant low-frequency hum of their disapproval. In a way, it was the most useful thing they ever did for us, though I doubt they'd see it that way. I don't hold that against them. But I don't pretend it didn't happen either. What I know is this: the people who build quietly are not building for the reveal. But the reveal comes regardless. The work speaks eventually. The only question is whether the people in the room are ready to hear it. That's my story. An envelope slid across a white tablecloth, a foundation that 14 years of quiet work made possible, and a room full of 400 people who learned, in one evening, that the Carpenter had been building something they hadn't seen. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. Have you ever dismissed someone or watched someone get dismissed because of what their work looked like on the outside, before you knew what it was on the inside? And when the truth came out, what did it cost the person who was wrong? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.